Avoda Tov, Chodesh Tov. Today's daf is daf Samach Zayin, and we'll begin with the wide lines on daf Samach Vav Amud Beis. The Gemara had recorded a machlokas between Abai and Rava regarding Reicha, when you have something that you smell from Isur, and whether or not Reach is a significant factor. So Amrav Mari Kitanoi. This issue about the status of Reach is in fact a machlokas Tanoim, and it's recorded in a Mishnah in Masechta Trumos. Harode pas chama, Ridias hapas means when you take the dough out of the oven, and we're talking about hot bread. Unesana al pi chavish shel yain shel truma. He places this hot bread on top of a cask that has in it truma. And now the question is whether this bread, because it absorbs the reach from the truma, now becomes osur l'zorim, and a non-Kohen is not allowed to eat that bread. Rabbi Meir oser, Rabbi Yehuda matir. The Mishnah records a three-way machlokas. The first sheet is Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir holds that reicha milsahi, that the Torah considers reach as if it were a be'en, as if it were a substance of Isur. And therefore, when the hot bread on top of the chavis shel truma absorbs the reach of truma, then a Zara, a non-Kohen, is not allowed to eat that bread. However, Rabbi Yehuda matir. Rabbi Yehuda apparently holds that reichel lav milsa, and the Torah does not consider the aroma as if it's a significant representation of the Isur. And finally, the Mishnah records a third opinion, and that is Rabbi Yossi matir b'shel chitim v'oser b'shel siorim. Rabbi Yossi makes a distinction between two types of breads. There's the bread that's made from wheat, and the bread that's made from barley. And what's the difference? Rabbi Yossi says that in the case of a bread made from wheat, then it's permissible. It's mutter. And he only prohibits it in the case of a bread made from barley. And why? Mipnei shasiorim shavos. Something in the nature of barley is that it absorbs the reach, so it's a very serious reach. Now, it would seem that Rabbi Yossi really belongs to the Shita of Rabbi Meir, recognizing and validating the significance of reach, just that he limits it. And he wants to know whether or not there is really reach or not. And that's the difference between a pashal chit and a pashal sior. My love, the Gemara says, shouldn't we assume, Bahakam miflagi, to Mar Savar, according to Rabbi Meir, Reicha Milsahi. Umar Savar, but Rabbi Yehuda, because he's matir the bread for non-Kohanim, is Reicha Lov Klumhu. Reach is not something, the Torah prohibits the be'en, the mamoshes, and the tam, but not the reach. So the Rava Vare Tanoihi. Rava is going to have to admit that his shita, according to which he says that Reicha Lav Milsahi, could only be reconciled with the shita Rabbi Yehuda. And he's going to have to concede that Rabbi Meir rejects his shita and holds Reicha Milsa. But Abaye, L'Abaye Milemo de Tanoihi, is Abaye totally boxed in to a corner over here in which he has to admit that he can only work out with Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yehuda's matir is a dissenting opinion who rejects Abaye's principle at Reicha Milsa. Omulcha Abaye, no. Lav mi itmar lo. We have a comment that was made on that Mishnah. Omer Rabba Omer Ishlok in the name Reish Lakish, bepas chama v'chavis psucha. If you have two factors in the negative, number one, the bread is hot right out of the oven, and therefore it absorbs reach. And number two, the barrel that's below the bread and is holding on to truma is psucha, it's open. So therefore you have a direct link between the reach of the truma on the bottom and the hot bread on top. And here we start today's daf. Is divrei hakol asura, meaning Rabbi Yehuda would even concede to the principle and accept the principle that reich milsa, reich is something significant. And therefore, if both the pas is a pas chama and the truma is in a chavis psucha, then certainly even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that the Zar cannot eat from this pas, from this bread. Now we go to the other extreme. Pas tzonenes v'chavis megufa. Megufa means, megufas hachavis means when they plaster down a cover over a barrel. And here you have two factors to be matir. Number one, the pas is tzonenes. It's not a fresh baked bread right out of the oven. So it doesn't really absorb. It's already hardened. And not only that, the truma is completely sealed within a barrel below the dough, below the bread. Is divrei hakol muteres. Lo nechluko v'pas chama v'chavos megufa v'pas sonez v'chavos psucha. In other words, if you have one factor which would contribute to reach and another factor which would block the reach, how do we judge that case? So, for example, if you have a pas sonenes, which is not so susceptible to reach, to absorb the aroma, but on the other hand, it's a chavis psucha. Or alternatively, let's say you have a pas chama, but the chavis is megufa. V'hadidi nami, and Abai says, when I came up with my statement, it was pas chama v'chavis psucha damin. It was a case that's similar to a pas chama and a chavis psucha, which means tarti l'reis. So the two factors here, which contribute to a profound absorption of the aroma, and therefore everybody would agree with me. There's no machlokas tanoim about this, that it's asur. Now, before we go on, let me just backtrack a drop here on Daf Samach Vav Amud Beis to the case of Bas Tiha. Now, what exactly is a Bas Tiha in which Abai said that it's Asur? We're talking about the wine of an akum, and it gives off an aroma. And Abai says that the Jew is not allowed to smell that aroma. If he does so, he violates the Isur Hana from Avoda Zara. And although this Bas Tia is really just a hole that's made in the stopper of a wine barrel, but if you put your nose into that, close enough to that stopper, or more accurately in the hole of the stopper, then he sort of, it's like a straw, he sucks in the aroma. And Abai is claiming that all the Tanoim would agree in that case that it's us. Now we go on in the Mishnah. Whenever you have a mixture, a taroves, then we try to check out and determine whether or not that Isur that fell into Heter gave Tam. However, the Mishnah wants to add the following stipulation. When do we say that the Tam of the Isur prohibits the entire mixture? That's only when the Tam of the Isur is l'shvach. it enhances the taste. But if it's lignai, if it detracts and it's detrimental to the taste, then it's mutter. And Amar Rabbi Yudam Shmuel, Hachi Hilchaso, we paskin that if it's no saint tam lifgam, then it's mutter. The Amar, furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Lo shanu ella shenosan lesoch grisim rochsi. The Mishnah had taught us that if vinegar, which has the status of yayin nesach, falls on top of beans, then it's mutter. It's, so to speak, the vinegar, the liquid, sort of rolls off the top of the solid beans. Comes along Shmuel and he says, that only applies to hot beans. Aval nafal etok grisin tzonin in vertichon, nasik mishish biach ubasof pogam v'oser. What happens is, if the chometz, this vinegar that's osur, falls on not hot beans, but cold beans, then there's a two-stage process. At stage number one, because the beans are cold and they're split, because that's what grisim are, they have cracks in them, crevices, and therefore the tam of the vinegar seeps in through the beans, through the splits and the crevices in the beans. And so far, it's no saint tam l'shvach. The vinegar actually enhances the taste of these beans. However, he went ahead and he heated up the beans. Now, once he heats up the beans, then the vinegar now enhances the taste of the beans. I'm sorry. When it first was cold beans, then it enhances the taste of the beans. But now that he heated them up, the vinegar has a detrimental impact on the taste of the beans. Nasik mishesh biach of sof pagam v'osu v'chein ki osu rav and Rav Yochanan lo shanu el shenofel atok grisin roschin aval nofel atok grisin sonin v'tichon nasik mishesh biach of sof pagam v'osu v'chein ki osu rav dimi kachi u'osim bi'arvish habos b'tzipori v'korno so shachlayim. So the Gemara presents the following thesis, that if at stage number one, because of the fact that the beans were cold, and as a fact they are split, and now the vinegar seeps into the beans, at that point it's already no saint tam l'shvach. What he did was he took this combination and he heated it up. Once he heated it up, it becomes no saint tam l'fgam, and it impairs the taste of the beans. But initially, it enhanced the taste of the beans. At that moment, says Shmuel, and so says Rabbi Yochanan, and so says Rav Dimi, they all agree that at that moment in time, it's asur, the tam of the yayin, of the vinegar, now generates an isur in the beans, and you can't be matir them in a subsequent act of heating up the beans. In any event, the Gemara gives an example in the city of Tzipori. They used to prepare a dish which is called shachalayim, and that's more or less what they did to prepare this dish. They would add vinegar to cold split beans to enhance their taste. So this proves that vinegar enhances the taste of cold split beans. Amar Reish Lakish. Now, Reish Lakish wants to analyze this halach of no saint tam lifgam. What happens in a situation where the reason why the added taste in the mixture from the Isser is negative and impairs the taste is because you're missing certain ingredients like spices or salt or other things of that sort, which if you had added them, it would be no Saint Tam L'Shvach. Do I have a right to say that since at stage one it was no Saint Tam L'Fgam, then I don't care what happens later on? Even if you tell me, well, we left out certain ingredients, and once we add those ingredients, it will be no Saint Tam L'Shvach, that's irrelevant. It already became mutter. And here we have two Lashonos in Reish Lakish. Let's learn first, obviously, the Lishna Kam. Reish Lakish, no Saint Tam L'Fgam Sha'amru, when they said that if the tam that's added into this mixture by the Isser is a tam pogum, it's pogame, it makes it detrimental. Lo sheyomru kederu zucha sera melach. This is not a situation where, you know what, we're missing, some sort of ingredient like salt. And if we would fill that need for adding salt, it would be a tam l'shvach, or the opposite, yisera melech. Maybe there's too much salt in this mixture. Chasera tavlin, maybe it's missing a certain spice. Yisera tavlin has too much of that spice. Elakol she'ein chasera klum, v'ein echeles mipnei zeh. When do we have a concept of no same tam lifgam? That's only because it's not missing anything. All the ingredients are there, and yet the admixture of that isur makes the food inedible. But Ika Diamri, according to the second Lishna of Reish Lakish, it's Lakula. No Saint Tam Lifgam Sha'omru, Ein Omru Keder Zu Chaser Melech Yiser Melech Chaser Tavlin Al Hashta Mias Ha Pagma. According to Lishna Basra in Reish Lakish, Gemara is going to try to support that Lishna Basra. Then, if it was no Saint Tam Lifgam, and that's what happened in reality, as soon as you added the Isur, it was poging the tam, then I don't care what you could salvage it, you could add ingredients that were left out, that's irrelevant. Once it was pogum, it does not generate an Isur later on. It cannot regenerate itself. Amar Abaye Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara wants to now support that second Lishna by quoting Rabbi Yochanan, Kol shetamo mamasho asur is lokin olav. I would take out the vav here. I don't think it's confusing. Just lokin olav. V'zeu k'zayis b'chtei achilas pras. And what we're touching on is a gigantic sugya in Hilchas Taroves. If we were learning Yeridea, we'd spend months on this. And that is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, there is a distinction between the following two scenarios. Scenario number one is that the Isur fell into the mixture and it's there, it's intact, it's be'en. In fact, not only is it be'en, but there's such a large volume of Isur that if within an achilas pras, let's call it 10 minutes or whatever it is, we'll see maybe what achilas pras is, aloch l'moshe misinai. Within that period of time, he will have consumed a full kazayis of the Isur. That's how much be'en is in the mixture. In that case, he gets malchus. What does he get malchus for? Apparently, he gets malchus for eating a kazayis b'chtei achilas pras. Or do we say no? Since that kazayis could have been b'chtei achilas pras, and it's a large enough volume that it asks the whole thing, then heter nasa isur. Now, what is kazayis b'chtei achilas pras? Now, pras is miloshen lifros. Lifros means to cut something in half. So the word pras means half a loaf of bread. Now, the standard loaf of bread has 24 beitzim, otherwise known as a kav. So that would mean that right, let's just go over this. "24 beitzim is the equivalent of 3 loaves of bread, which means that every loaf of bread has 8 beitzim. 8 times 3 is 24. And half of a loaf of bread would be the equivalent of 4 beitzim. Now, this is one shita. There's another shita, and there's tremendous nafkaminas between these shitas, is that a pras equals 3 beitzim. Not 4 beitzim, but 3 beitzim. Now, what does it mean when we talk about loaves of bread? That's a sugya in Eruvin. At the end of the Masechta, the Mishnah quotes a loaf of bread that's roy for shtei seudos, meaning it suffices for 2 meals, which would mean that a pras, which is a half a loaf, was the amount that you would eat in 1 meal. Again, the halacha of kezais b'teachil's pras, as we mentioned earlier, is halacha of Moshe Misina. And it establishes that anything eaten within the time it takes to eat a pras, which is 1 standard meal, is considered as having been eaten in 1 act of achila. So if you eat kezayis of macholas asuris, you'll get malchus, even if you didn't eat the entire mixture at one time, as long as he ate it within that span of time, which is called kezayich b'steachilus pras. So now we have a taroves of macholas asuras together with heter, and he eats this taroves, which has both prohibited food and permitted food. Says Rabbi Yochanan, if the prohibited food was mixed with permitted food, and the prohibited food's flavor and substance are present, then if he eats from this mixture, he's liable to malchus if in the course of eating he has ingested a kezayis of prohibited food. And all this within the span of Kedei Achilas Pras. So just again to summarize, Rabbi Yochanan's first halacha is that if you have both tamu mamash, so everything is there from the Easter mixed in, and you can eat an entire kezayis' worth of Easter within a span of Kedei Achilas Pras, the amount it would take to eat 1 meal, or whatever that is. Let's call it 10 minutes. Within 10 minutes, he ate from this mixture an entire kezayis of machal sasuras. He gets malchus.